October 1917. The Admiralty Building in London. A young woman named Dilwyn Knox stares at a sheet of paper covered in seemingly random letters and numbers. Her eyes are bloodshot from lack of sleep. Her hands tremble slightly as she reaches for another cup of cold tea. Outside, the streets of London are darkening under the autumn sky, but in this cramped office on the top floor time has lost all meaning. Knox and her colleagues have been working for 36 hours straight, and they know that millions of lives depend on what they can decipher from these coded messages. The situation facing Britain in October 1917 was nothing short of catastrophic. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. In April alone, over 880,000 tons of Allied shipping had gone to the bottom of the Atlantic. Food supplies in Britain had dwindled to just 6 weeks. 6 weeks. That was all that stood between the British people and mass starvation. The government had introduced rationing, but even that might not be enough if the losses continued at this rate. Every day, another dozen ships failed to reach port. Every day, the noose tightened. The German Naval Command had refined their tactics to devastating effect. Their U-boats no longer hunted randomly across the vast Atlantic. Instead, they operated in coordinated wolf packs, positioned along the most heavily traveled shipping lanes. And they were guided by an increasingly sophisticated Cipher system that allowed them to communicate their positions, coordinate attacks, and report successes back to their commanders in Germany. The British Admiralty knew that German submarines were out there, lurking beneath the waves, but they had no way of knowing where. It was like fighting an invisible enemy in the dark. Room 40, the Admiralty's code-breaking unit, had been established early in the war, housed in the old Admiralty building overlooking Horse Guards Parade. The room itself was unremarkable, a former storage space converted into an office, but the work done there was anything but ordinary. The team consisted of an unlikely collection of civilians, mathematicians from Cambridge, linguists who had studied obscure languages, chess champions, crossword enthusiasts, and even a few former schoolteachers. They were not soldiers. They had never fired a rifle or charged across no man's land, but they were about to fight one of the most important battles of the entire war. The story of their breakthrough begins with a man named Alfred Ewing, a Scottish physicist who had been recruited to lead the code-breaking effort. Ewing understood that the German naval codes were based on mathematical principles, but they were constantly evolving. The Germans had learned from earlier British successes in breaking their codes. After the famous Zimmermann telegram had been intercepted and decoded earlier in 1917, revealing Germany's attempt to ally with Mexico against the United States, the German cryptographers had introduced new layers of complexity to their naval ciphers. They called these evolved systems the Zimmermann variants, and they were fiendishly difficult to crack. Each variant used a different key that changed daily, sometimes even hourly. The cipher involved substitution, transposition, and a complex mathematical algorithm that scrambled the original message beyond recognition. To make matters worse, the Germans had introduced dummy messages, false coordinates, and deliberate errors designed to mislead anyone who might be attempting to break the code. It was a game of cat and mouse played at the highest level of intellectual warfare. Dilly Knox, whose full name was Alfred Dilwyn Knox, was one of the most brilliant minds in Room 40. A classic scholar from Cambridge, he had an almost supernatural ability to see patterns where others saw only chaos. He had been working on the German naval codes for months, filling notebook after notebook with calculations, frequency analyses, and potential key sequences. By October 1917, he was close to a breakthrough, but close was not good enough. Ships were sinking, people were dying, time was running out. On the morning of October 17th, a German radio transmission was intercepted by a listening post on the east coast of England. The message was longer than usual, which immediately caught the attention of the Room 40 team. Longer messages meant more data to work with, more patterns to analyze. The transmission was rushed to the Admiralty, and Knox began working on it immediately. He noticed something unusual. Buried within the seemingly random characters was a sequence that repeated 3 times. Repetition was the enemy of any cipher. It was a crack in the armor, a tiny opening that a skilled codebreaker could exploit. Knox called over his colleague, a young mathematician named Frank Birch, who had joined Room 40 after teaching at Cambridge. Together, they began to work through the possibilities. If the repeated sequence represented the same word or phrase in the original German text, they could use it as a wedge to pry open the rest of the message. But what word or phrase would appear 3 times in a German naval transmission? They tried common military terms: position, coordinates, attack. Nothing fit. Hours passed. The room grew colder as the autumn evening set in, but neither man noticed. They were locked in a battle of wits with an unknown German cryptographer hundreds of miles away. It was Birch who had the crucial insight. What if the repeated sequence was not a military term at all, but something more mundane? What if it was a date or a time? German military communications often included timestamps. Birch suggested they try the German word for October, October. Knox's hands moved quickly across the paper, applying this assumption to the cipher. And suddenly, like a door swinging open, the code began to yield its secrets. The repeated sequence was indeed October, used 3 times to mark different timestamps in the message. With this key, they could begin to unravel the rest. Over the next 12 hours, working without rest, Knox and Birch decoded the entire transmission. What they found was nothing short of a treasure map for the Royal Navy. The message was a detailed set of instructions from German Naval Command to 3 separate U-boat groups operating in the Atlantic. It included their current positions, their assigned patrol routes for the next week, and the coordinates of the shipping lanes they were ordered to monitor. It was exactly what the Admiralty needed. But there was a problem. If the British suddenly changed convoy routes based on this intelligence, the Germans would realize their codes had been broken. They would change their cipher system, and Room 40 would be back to square one. The intelligence had to be used carefully, subtly, in a way that would not alert the enemy. This required a delicate balance, and the decision was made at the highest levels of the Admiralty. Captain Reginald Hall, the Director of Naval Intelligence, was a master of deception. He understood that intelligence was only valuable if it could be acted upon without revealing its source. Hall devised a plan. The convoy routes would be changed, but not all at once. Some convoys would be rerouted based on the decoded intelligence, while others would continue on their original paths. To the Germans, it would appear to be random chance, not a systematic response to compromised communications. Additionally, the Royal Navy would stage fake sightings of U-boats in areas where none actually existed, using seaplanes and patrol boats to create the illusion that British intelligence was based on visual reconnaissance rather than code breaking. The first test of this strategy came on October 23rd. A convoy of 12 merchant ships, carrying grain from Canada and beef from Argentina, was scheduled to sail along a route that the decoded German message had revealed was heavily patrolled by U-boats. Based on the Room 40 intelligence, the convoy was rerouted 200 miles to the north, adding 2 days to the journey but avoiding the submarine Wolf Pack entirely. The convoy reached Liverpool without incident. Not a single ship was lost. Over the following weeks, as Knox and his team continued to break the daily variations of the German Cipher, the impact became dramatic. Convoy planners at the Admiralty now had advanced knowledge of where U-boats were concentrated. They could route ships around the danger zones, and they could dispatch destroyer escorts to areas where submarines were known to be operating. The destroyers, equipped with depth charges and hydrophones, could hunt the U-boats rather than simply reacting to attacks. The numbers told the story. In September 1917, before the breakthrough, British and Allied merchant losses had totaled over 300,000 tons. By December, after 3 months of using the decoded intelligence, losses had dropped to under 180,000 tons. By February 1918, the figure had fallen below 100,000 tons. The U-boat stranglehold on Britain's supply lines had been broken. The threat of starvation receded. Food began to flow into British ports once more, but the work of Room 40 was far from over. The Germans, though they did not realize their codes had been broken, continued to refine and complicate their cipher systems. Each new variant required fresh analysis, new techniques, new breakthroughs. Knox and his colleagues worked around the clock, often sleeping on cots in the office, sustained by tea, cigarettes, and the knowledge that their work was saving lives. One member of the team, a young woman named Dilly Knox's sister Olive, had joined Room 40 as a clerk but quickly proved herself as a talented cryptanalyst. Women were not supposed to be involved in such sensitive intelligence work, but the demands of war had broken down many traditional barriers. Olive Knox had a particular talent for recognizing patterns in the transposition elements of the cipher. She developed a system of colored pencils to track different layers of encryption, creating visual maps of the code that helped her colleagues see connections they might otherwise have missed. The human cost of this silent war was real, even if it was not measured in blood and explosions. The mental strain of code breaking was immense. The pressure of knowing that every hour of delay meant more ships sunk, more sailors drowned, more civilians going hungry, weighed heavily on the Room 40 team. Several members suffered nervous breakdowns and had to be replaced. Others developed chronic insomnia, unable to stop their minds from analyzing patterns even when they tried to sleep. Dilly Knox himself pushed his body and mind to the breaking point. By early 1918, he was working 20-hour days, barely eating, his health deteriorating. His colleagues worried about him, but Knox insisted that the work was too important to slow down. He had developed an almost obsessive relationship with the German ciphers, as if he were engaged in a personal duel with the enemy cryptographers. Every time he broke a new variant, he felt a surge of triumph. Every time the Germans introduced a new complication, he took it as a personal challenge. The impact of Room 40's work extended beyond simply saving merchant ships. The decoded intelligence also provided crucial information about German naval movements and strategy. In early 1918, as the United States began sending troops to Europe in large numbers, the safe passage of American troop transports became a top priority. The German Navy knew that sinking ships full of American soldiers would be a devastating blow to Allied morale and military strength. U-boats were specifically tasked with targeting these transports, but Room 40 was reading their orders. Every time the Germans positioned submarines to intercept American troop ships, the British knew about it in advance. The transports were rerouted, and destroyer escorts were positioned to protect them. Over the course of 1918, more than 2 million American soldiers crossed the Atlantic to join the fight in France. Not a single troop transport was sunk by a U-boat. Not one. This was not luck. This was the direct result of the intelligence provided by the codebreakers of Room 40. The psychological impact on the German Naval Command was significant, though they never fully understood what was happening. U-boat captains reported that convoys seemed to be avoiding them, that the hunting grounds that had once been rich with targets were now mysteriously empty. Some German officers began to suspect that their codes might be compromised, but they could never prove it. The British deception operations, the fake sightings and the carefully calibrated responses, maintained the illusion that British success was due to improved tactics and luck rather than intelligence. By the summer of 1918, as the war entered its final phase, the U-boat threat had been effectively neutralized. German submarine losses were mounting as British anti-submarine warfare became more effective, guided by the precise intelligence from Room 40. The flow of supplies and reinforcements to Britain and France continued uninterrupted. The German High Command strategy of starving Britain into submission had failed, not because of superior British naval power, but because a small group of civilians in a cramped London office had won the invisible war of codes and ciphers. When the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, the members of Room 40 received no public recognition. Their work remained classified, hidden behind layers of official secrecy. Dilly Knox and his colleagues went back to their pre-war lives, to universities and teaching positions, carrying with them the knowledge that they had helped win the war, but unable to speak of it to anyone. Knox returned to Cambridge, where he continued his work on ancient Greek papyri, applying the same analytical skills he had used to break German codes to deciphering ancient texts. It would be decades before the full story of Room 40 emerged. Only after the Second World War, when the importance of code-breaking at Bletchley Park became known, did historians begin to piece together the crucial role that Room 40 had played in the First World War. The techniques developed by Knox and his colleagues, the methods of frequency analysis, pattern recognition, and systematic decryption, would form the foundation for the even more sophisticated code-breaking efforts of the next war. The impact of their work cannot be overstated. By breaking the German naval codes in October 1917 and maintaining that capability through the end of the war, Room 40 saved thousands of ships, tens of thousands of lives, and quite possibly prevented Britain from being forced out of the war due to starvation. The 60% reduction in merchant ship losses was not just a statistic. It represented families that were fed, soldiers that reached the front, and a nation that survived its darkest hour. This was a different kind of heroism, one that required no physical courage but demanded intellectual brilliance, mental endurance, and the ability to work under crushing pressure while knowing that failure meant death for others. The men and women of Room 40 fought their war with pencils and paper, with mathematical formulas and linguistic analysis, with patience and persistence. They never fired a shot, never saw the enemy face to face, but they won one of the most decisive victories of the entire war. Their story reminds us that wars are won not only on battlefields, but in the quiet rooms where brilliant minds wage silent campaigns against the codes and secrets of the enemy.